All right, let's move to the story now. Today, the Constitutional Court upheld an important ruling by lower courts on divorce law. It's set to advantage a spouse who didn't work outside the home during the marriage, but contributed to raising any children and taking care of the home. It relates specifically to people who've been married under an antenuptial contract without accrual. Let's speak to Beverly Clark, attorney and divorce mediator from Clarks Attorneys. Beverly, thank you so much for joining us. I think let's start at the beginning, because there's one case that led to all these changes. It was your case, so tell us about it.
So it's a very familiar story, Sally. Our client, who we'll call Mrs. G, that's what the courts have called her, was married in 1987 when she was 22 years old. The day before the marriage, she was presented by her husband's family with an antenuptial contract, which excluded the accrual system. 30 years later, she had raised 3 children, managed the household, and worked very much alongside her husband, who has a huge farming business. And, you know, farmers' wives work 24/7. And at the end of the marriage, because of the terms of the antenuptial contract, she essentially had no claim. So she had been to see a number of attorneys, and they all said to her, sorry, that's the law. And she came to see us, and we've seen so much injustice over the years with this particular term of the Divorce Act, which says that if you were married after November 1984 with an antenuptial contract that excludes the accrual system, the court has no discretion to interfere, no matter how unfair the consequences will be on divorce. So as from today, that has changed, and the court now will be able to use its discretion in certain circumstances to look back over the marriage and to avoid gross unfairness or inequity in certain circumstances when a spouse has made a contribution, albeit in the domestic sphere. And that will have a value, and that spouse can be compensated by way of a redistribution order.
So it's not retrospective, but for people going through a divorce currently, bearing in mind it takes a long time for laws to change, as we've just heard with the South African anti-doping issue, what does it mean for divorces currently underway?
So it makes no difference if you have already been divorced. You cannot come for a second bite at the cherry. But if you are not yet divorced and you are married with one of those kind of antenuptial contracts, and believe me, there are thousands and thousands of people, particularly women, who are in this disadvantaged situation and who often have felt trapped in unhappy or even abusive marriages, they should see their attorneys and they should amend their divorce claim, because they now have a claim for a redistribution of assets.
Let's understand accrual. So you can have an antenuptial contract with accrual and without accrual. So with accrual, and this is my understanding from my own marriage, is that an antenuptial contract means you basically bring in your assets that you come into the marriage, those stay yours forever.
Yes.
But with accrual means that from the moment that you're married, whatever you amass, whatever wealth you amass as a couple is then split.
At the end of the marriage.
At the end of the marriage.
Yes.
Should the marriage end.
Yes.
So
well, by death or divorce.
Okay. So without accrual, that basically means that if your partner's the one going out and making a lot of money, in the event of a divorce without the accrual system, you wouldn't have been able to claim any of that money. Does that actually mean, in effect, that an antenuptial contract without accrual is no longer legal?
Not at all. The fundamental principle in our law is that contracts must be enforced. But there are many spheres, since we've been in the constitutional era, where our courts, in the interests of justice and our legislation, have changed, have interfered with people's contractual choices in order to avoid unfairness. So the Consumer Protection Act, the National Credit Act, those sort of things, there are now protections. And the same thing in divorces, in marriages. Fundamentally, your contract is upheld, but the court may interfere to some extent to avoid unfairness. So it certainly doesn't now equate to being married in community of property or being married with accrual, because there's not an automatic redistribution. You will have to prove that you have made a contribution and that you have contributed to the maintenance or increase in the value of your spouse's estate.
So my understanding, where does the role of alimony come in? My understanding is that alimony is what a partner has a right to in the event of a divorce if they never worked.
Not at all. So, firstly, alimony in South Africa we call maintenance, and there are only limited circumstances in which you are entitled to maintenance. But it's undesirable because it maintains a relationship of dependence. And every month you're hoping that your maintenance is going to get paid, and otherwise you're going to have to chase them up. And in any event, maintenance caters really to your needs, your basic needs. It doesn't compensate you for the work and the contribution that you made during the marriage. And that is the big difference with what we are asking for is a redistribution order. That is compensation for the role that you played and the enormous amount of work and the value that you provided.
How do you prove that?
There's a very long line of cases which set out what is considered to be a contribution worthy of compensation. But until today, it only applied to marriages pre-1984. But those considerations and factors will now be taken into account going forward in all marriages, so post-84 marriages as well.
And how's Mrs. G doing these days?
She is, I think, much stronger than when she left the marriage. She has been very brave. She's been, it's courageous to take on a constitutional case. And she has stuck it out, and she is very delighted. We now, of course, still have to go through the whole divorce process, and we have to prove exactly that. Did she, in fact, make a contribution? And that is, I suppose you'll watch the space and see what happens. But she has this deep sense of justice, and she's delighted about what this has done for so many other people, and particularly women.
Yeah, absolutely. It's completely fascinating. And thank you so much for joining us this
Sally.
evening. Beverly Clark is an attorney and divorce mediator from Clarks Attorneys. In fact, their client is the person who has, in effect, changed divorce law, because today the Constitutional Court endorsed the decision of lower courts that it was actually unconstitutional for accrual without accrual in a marriage on certain aspects to exist the way it is. And this doesn't act retrospectively, but if you are in the process of a divorce, it's something you need to look into. Fascinating indeed. Thank you so much for joining us, Bev.